Start. How and in what mode, again, the Holy Church of God is the image and representation also of the soul when considered on its own. Furthermore, the Blessed Elder taught that the Holy Church is not only able to be the image of the whole human being, I am speaking about man who is comprised of soul and body in union, but also of the soul itself, when contemplated on its own by reason. He said then that the soul is comprised in total of an intellectual and an animate power. The intellectual power, which moves by self-determination according to its own will, and the animate power, which remains as it is according to nature by lack of choice. And again, he said that both the contemplative and the practical parts belong to the intellectual power, and that the contemplative part is called the mind, whereas the practical part is called reason. The mind is the part that causes motion in the intellectual power, while reason is the part that is provident in the animate power. Note, provident. This word means taking care for or showing forethought for. However, the term also carries clear etymological links to mind and intellectual. It is and is called wisdom. I'm speaking now about the mind. Whenever it completely keeps its own motions unchangeably toward God. So wisdom is when the intellect keeps its own motions unchangeably toward God. In the same way, reason is and is called prudence whenever by discretion it demonstrates itself to be no different from the mind because it joins the animate power, which reason controls according to providence, to the activities, and the animate power bears an identical and equal reflection of the divine as the mind through virtue. And he said that the animate power is assigned to the mind and reason by nature, since the soul has been demonstrated in its essence to consist of, or rather to be mind and reason, because it is intellectual and rational, and the animate power, because it is contemplated by both equally. I am speaking of mind and reason. For it is not proper to consider that either of these are without a share of life, and comprehended by both. Note, the logic of Maximus's deduction turns on the etymological relationship of the Greek terms life and animate. The animate power is assigned to both the mind and reason, and so is not reasonable that either the mind or reason should be without life. Through the animate power, the mind, which we said is also called wisdom, when it is explained in the contemplative habit, or rather, I'll read that sentence again. Through the animate power, the mind, which we said is also called wisdom when it is explained in the contemplative habit according to the ineffable silence and knowledge, is led to the truth through unforgettable and incessant knowledge. Note, explained, the word means to explain or unfold, and is a compound form of a different word, which means to be simple or to make one. In Maximus's mind, intellection is the process by which the many are made one. We therefore correctly understand something when we perceive the unity in any particular complex reality. Because it is God who unifies everything, every act of intellection is an encounter with God. That's really, really good. Okay. But I'm going to read that sentence again. Through the animate power, the mind, which we said is also called wisdom, when it is explained in the contemplative habit according to the ineffable silence and knowledge, is led to the truth through unforgettable and incessant knowledge. And through the animate power, reason, which we called prudence, comes to an end salvifically in the good through faith by the practical habit according to virtue. Note, Maximus is saying that our reason is sanctified through the practice of virtues. From both the mind and reason, true expertise of divine and human realities unite, a knowledge which is actually infallible knowledge, and the end of every divine philosophy according to Christians. To speak more clearly about these things, the Blessed Elder said that the soul possesses a contemplative part and a practical part, even as I said above. The contemplative part he called the mind, and the practical part he called reason, since they are clearly the primary powers of the soul. And again, the mind he called wisdom, and reason he called understanding, since they are the primary activities of the soul. And again, in more detail, he said that according to the intellectual part, the soul possesses the mind, wisdom, contemplation, knowledge, and ceaseless knowledge. Truth is the end of these things, and according to the rational part, the soul possesses reason, prudence, practice, virtue, and faith. The good is the end of these things. Truth and the good, he said, reveal God. Truth reveals God whenever the divine seems to be signified from existence. For truth is a simple, solitary, unified, identical, indivisible, unchangeable, passionless, inescapable, and absolutely eternal reality. And the good reveals God whenever the divine seems to be signified from activity, for the good is beneficent, provident, and watchful over everything that comes from it. And according to the opinion of the etymologists, the good is that which abundantly exists or is situated or runs, for it bestows existence and permanence and movement to everything that is. So notes 61 and 62. The personal pronoun we have here translated it could also be translated him, in which case God would be the antecedent. Maximus's observation is that the etymologists claim that the active good derives from the adverb in abundance. Then he said that the 5 pairs of the soul that we discussed above are parallel to the pair that signifies the divine. The pairs of which I am now speaking are the mind and reason, wisdom and prudence, contemplation and practice, knowledge and virtue, ceaseless knowledge, and faith. Truth and the good are the pair that signifies the divine. And when the soul is moved by progression in the above-mentioned pairs, and when the soul imitates the unchangeability and beneficence of God's being and activity through steadfastness to the good and the immutability of its habit according to choice, it is united to God, to the God of all things. So these are the paths to truth and the good. And if I might add to these things one small useful contemplation, perhaps these 5 pairs are the divine decad, the 10 strings of the intelligible harp of the soul. The 5 pairs contain the word that resounds in the spirit through the other blessed decad of the 10 commandments, and they perform in an intelligible manner. When the soul makes progress in its motion toward the above-mentioned virtues, and when the soul imitates the immutability of God in the habits it has developed through choosing virtue consistently. The 5 pairs contain the word that resounds in the spirit through the other blessed decad of the 10 commandments, and they perform in an intelligible manner the majestic, harmonious, and melodious notes through which God is praised in song. Majestic. Note, the word literally means complete, full. The word bears an affinity to the word to command, and therefore appears to be a natural word choice to describe a command. And this is so in order that I might learn what is the word of the singing decad, and what is the word of the sung decad, and how a decad is mystically made one with and joined to another decad. On the one hand, the decad draws me back to him, Jesus, God my Savior, and the one who is fulfilled through me, the one who is being saved, and yet one who is always full and always overflowing, and never able to deplete himself. Wow. So going back, so mystically made one with and joined to another decad, So the note here is Maximus teaches that God delivers the same message in the 10 virtues and in the 10 commandments. The 10 virtues are, presumably, the singing decad, given the active role in the metaphor assumed by the 10 strings of the harp as the source of sound. The sung decad is the 10 commandments. And then 73, the decad draws me back to him. This term could also be translated himself, and therefore Maximus may intend a Christological reference in this context as well. The decad is this summary of God's revelatory message, expressed in both the sensible realm by the 10 commandments and the intelligible realm by the 10 virtues. And then finally 74, which is right here, the one who is fulfilled. This word could also be translated fulfilled together. Maximus is saying that Jesus is fulfilled together with us, and so we partake in God's nature in our salvation. But on the other hand, the decad marvelously restores me, the man. Man is clearly parallel to Savior from the line above. In fact, these several lines could be readily replaced into a chiasm. But on the other hand, the decad marvelously restores me, the man, to myself, or rather to God, from whom I received and now possess being, and to whom I am driven from afar, longing also to receive well-being. The one who is able to learn from experience will certainly know what we are speaking about, because he will have already clearly recognized from experience the dignity that is proper to him, how it is given back to the image, what is made after the image, and how the archetype is honored, and what is the power of the mystery of our salvation, and for whom Christ died, and how, again, we are able to abide in him and he in us, even as the Scripture says, and how the word of the Lord is upright, and all his works are in faithfulness. But let us return to the discourse to its outline, for these things suffice for the moment. For the blessed elder said that the mind, when moved through wisdom, enters into contemplation, and through contemplation into knowledge, and through knowledge into ceaseless knowledge, and through ceaseless knowledge into truth. The mind receives the end of its motion in truth, because truth defines the limits of the mind's essence and power and habit and activity. For he said that wisdom is a power of the mind, and that the mind itself is wisdom in power, and that contemplation is habit in power, and that knowledge is activity in power, and ceaseless knowledge is ceaseless motion, the incessant and habitual motion of wisdom and contemplation and knowledge, that is to say, of power and habit and activity. That is beyond the known and above all knowledge, and its limit is the truth as that which is inescapably known. And this merits our wonder, how that which is unforgettable comes to an end when it is limited or concluded in truth, that is, in God, for God is truth. And because the mind is incessantly and unforgettably moved around him, its motion does not come to an end, because it does not find a limit where there is no dimension. For the wonderful greatness of the divine limitlessness is without quantity, without parts, completely dimensionless. And in order that we should know whatever this limitlessness is in its essence, this limitlessness arrives at the greatness that cannot be comprehended. And because the greatness has no dimension and cannot be comprehended, it is therefore not navigable by anyone. Maximus here summarizes his theological quest in a single paradox. We seek to know God, but God is infinite and we are finite, and so any true knowledge of God should be impossible. And again, the blessed elder said that reason, when moved through understanding, enters into practice, through practice into virtue, and through virtue into faith, which is truly the firm and infallible certainty about divine things. Reason has this certainty, first in power according to prudence, and it is demonstrated lastly in activity according to virtue in the manifestation of works, for faith apart from works is dead. Note, the terms firm certainty are certainly favorite terms of the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews. Yet the above line from Maximus does not echo any one specific passage from Hebrews. I gotta go back. Reason has this certainty first in power according to prudence, and it is demonstrated lastly in activity according to virtue in the manifestation of works. For faith apart from works is dead, as it has been written, and no one who thinks correctly would ever venture to say that anything dead and ineffective should be counted among the beautiful. No one would ever venture to say that anything dead and ineffective should be counted among the beautiful. And reason enters through faith into the good, where it receives its end and ceases from its own activities, because the limits of its power, habit, and activity are defined. For he said that prudence is a power of reason, and reason itself is prudence in power. Practice is habit in power, and virtue is activity in power. And the faith that comes from prudence, conduct, and virtue, that is to say, from power, habit, and activity, is the inner and unchangeable stability, whose farthest limit is the good, and reason comes to an end and ceases from motion around the good, for God is the good, in whom every power of every reason is limited by nature. But it does not pertain to the present subject to define and to say how and in what mode each of these things is accomplished and led into activity, and what is opposed to or associated with each of these things, and to what extent, except to the extent of knowing that when every soul is able, through the grace of the Holy Spirit and its own hard work and diligence, to join and weave these things to one another, that is, reason to the mind, prudence to wisdom, practice to contemplation, virtue to knowledge, and faith to ceaseless knowledge. And when none of these is inferior or superior to the other, and every superiority and inferiority among them is eliminated, and, if I may speak concisely, the soul's decad becomes a monad, then the soul is also made one with the true and the good and the one and only God. Note: the term is here when it says the extent of knowing that when every soul is able. The term is correlative with then in the following sentence. Maximus is clear that all of the following are conditions of the soul's union with God. And the soul becomes beautiful and magnificent, and, as far as it is possible, like him by fulfilling the 4 cardinal virtues, which point toward the divine decad of the soul, and also comprise the other blessed decad of the 10 Commandments. For the tetrad is the decad in power, which is composed of the monad in sequence by progression. The tetrad is the decad in power, which is composed of the monad in sequence by progression. And again, the same monad, monadically, it contains the good by integration and demonstrates that the simple and that which is without parts of the divine activity is divided indivisibly from itself. By these decads, the soul strains itself to keep the good which is proper to it unharmed, on the one hand, and on the other it courageously drives away that which is foreign to the soul as evil. This is so because by these decads the soul possesses a rational mind, a prudent wisdom, a practical contemplation, a virtuous knowledge, and the most faithful and unchanging ceaseless knowledge. And because the soul brings the effects to their causes and the activities to their powers, which have been joined to God by prudence, and she receives in return for these theosis, which produces simplicity. Wow. That page needs to be studied. For this reason, indeed, an activity and manifestation of the mind, as an effect as is of a cause, and prudence of wisdom, and practice of contemplation, and virtue of knowledge, and faith of ceaseless knowledge. And from these the inner relationship of the true and the good, I'm speaking about God, is fashioned. And the blessed elder said that this interrelationship is divine expertise and infallible knowledge and love and peace, in which and through which is theosis. It is divine expertise because it is the fulfillment of all knowledge that is possible for men concerning God and divine things, and the content of the virtues. It is infallible knowledge because it genuinely enters into the truth and produces a lasting experience of the divine. It is love because it partakes completely in the complete delight of God by disposition. It is peace because it suffers the same things as God and prepares those who are worthy to suffer, to live according to peace. Wow. For if the divine is completely immovable because it does not have anything that disturbs it, for what can attain to the contemplation of the divine, and if peace is unshaken and immovable steadiness, and additionally undisturbed gladness, then every soul experiences divine things when it is deemed worthy to bring divine peace. The soul experiences the divine things because, if it is right to speak so, it transcends the boundaries not only of what we determine to be wickedness and ignorance, falsehood and evil, the wicked things that resist virtue and knowledge, truth and the good, and that stand alongside the movements of the soul that are contrary to nature, but it also transcends the boundaries of its own virtue and knowledge, truth and goodness. The soul quiets itself in an ineffable and unknowable fashion for an intercourse with God that is absolutely beyond truth and beyond good, and that he offered us according to his most trustworthy promise. So where it says experiences divine things, oh, that's from Pseudo-Dionysius. And then later down here when it says the soul quiets itself, the verb quiets is syntactically parallel to the verb transcends above. Thus Maximus is saying the soul experiences the divine things because it transcends and because it quiets itself. For at last there is not anything that by nature disturbs it and enters its hiddenness in God. It is there that the awe-inspiring mystery of the unity that is beyond mind and reason, the blessed and all-holy intercourse, is celebrated. The mystery through which God will become one flesh and one spirit with the church, that is, the soul and the soul with God. How I will worship you for your goodness, O Christ. But I will not dare to sing praises or speak, I who do not have sufficient ability to worship you in a worthy manner. For the two shall become one flesh, and this mystery is great. And I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church, says the divine apostle. And again, but he who is united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. There's a lot of references there. Look at a lot of scriptural references. Reference 96, which is here. The blessed and all holy intercourse is celebrated. By this he means the Eucharist, or it could be. And then, so then, because the soul becomes one in this fashion and is brought together to itself and to God, there will be no reason for further divide the soul conceptually into many parts. The soul has been crowned as the head by the first, only, and one God, the Word. All the principles of everything that exists are and subsist singly in him according to one unintelligible simplicity, since he is the creator and maker of everything that exists. Looking intently on him who is not outside the soul, but the whole in the whole soul. In other words, it is God who gives unity and coherence to the soul's being. Even the soul, by this simple contact, will see into the principles and the causes of the things that exist. Before the soul was wedded to God the Word, it was led into divisive pursuits, perhaps by the principles and causes, but it is now being brought salvifically and harmoniously, even through them, to him. the one who is the maker of and encompasses every principle and every cause. Therefore, since these things are proper to the soul, as we said above, on the one hand, according to the mind, the soul possesses wisdom and power, and from whence wisdom contemplation, and from this knowledge, and from knowledge ceaseless knowledge. Through knowledge, and from knowledge ceaseless knowledge. Let me restart. Therefore, since these things are proper to the soul, as we said above, on the one hand, according to the mind, the soul possesses wisdom and power, and from wisdom contemplation, and from this knowledge, and from knowledge ceaseless knowledge, through which the soul is led to the truth, which exists as the limit and end of the good things according to the mind. But on the other hand, according to reason, the soul possesses prudence, and from this practice, and from practice virtue, and from this faith, according to which the soul ends in the good, as the blessed end of the rational activities. Through these activities, expertise in divine things is gathered by integration from the oneness of all. We added in all to the English text in order to note that Maximus is referring here to the Decad. The oneness of all of these things with one another. The Holy Church of God, which is imaged by the soul, will be seen to correspond clearly with all these things in contemplation, on the one hand. The Church signifies, through the sanctuary, everything that has been demonstrated to exist by progression according to the mind and from the mind. And on the other hand, the Church articulates through the nave the things that have been revealed to exist by precept according to reason and from reason. Note: at the beginning of chapter 5, Maximus divided the Decad into two parts, representing the mind and reason as two parts of the soul. He returns to this paradigm now. The sanctuary, i.e. the part of the Church that corresponds to the mind of the soul, is the place where the people are exhorted to live according to virtue, and where one progresses in the virtues. The nave, the part of the Church that corresponds to reason of the soul, is the place where the commandments are delivered and where one learns the precepts. The Church brings together all things to the mystery performed on the divine altar, and therefore the one who is able to be initiated in prudence and wisdom through the rites that are celebrated in the Church establishes his very soul as a church truly of God and divine. The Church made by hands has been built in wisdom for the soul, and also as a symbolic model of the soul through the Church's various divine rites. It was given to us as a guide to that which is better. I'm confused. I think this is... okay, that's a typo. Oh, that changed the way I read that. I'll reread from 106. The Church brings together all things to the mystery performed on the divine altar, and therefore the one who is able to be initiated in prudence and wisdom through the rites that are celebrated in the Church establishes his very soul as a church truly of God and divine. The Church made by hands has been built in wisdom for the soul, and also as a symbolic model for the soul through the Church's various divine rites. It was given to us as a guide to that which is better. And that ends chapter 5, pages 59 through 68, really.